Good evening, everyone. Today we shall be reading Guerrilla Warfare by Chairman Mao Zedong. It is presently 7 p.m. or 1900 hours on Saturday, March 23rd, 2019. Now, I've been meaning to read this for a while, and since I had the time right now, I figured now's as good a time as any, so here we are. This particular edition is a PDF copy that I found after a cursory Google search, and it appears to have been published for use and consumption by members of the United States Marine Corps. Anyway, so yeah, there may have been some sections taken out or censored as a consequence of that, but regardless, as a tactical manual, it should still hold up water. So, let's begin here. Mao Zedong's On Guerrilla Warfare, cataloging publication number FMFRP 12-18, published by the United States Marine Corps, Distribution Statement A. Approved for public release, distribution is unlimited. Another cataloging number here, PCN 140-121-800-00. Department of the Navy, Headquarters, United States Marine Corps, Washington, D.C., and I'm not sure what this number here is, 20380-0001. Published the 5th of April, 1989. Forward. 1. Purpose. Fleet Marine Force Reference Publication, that's what that previous statement stood for, FMFRP 12-18, Mao Zedong, On Guerrilla Warfare, is published to ensure the retention and dissemination of useful information which is not intended to become doctrine or to be published in Fleet Marine Force manuals. FMFRPs in the 12 series are a special category of publications, reprints of historical works which were published commercially and are no longer in print. 2. Scope. This reference publication is Mao Zedong's thoughts and philosophy on guerrilla warfare. It gives the reader a chance to learn about this type of warfare from one who lived and fought as a guerrilla for most of his adult life. It is important to understand his philosophy on guerrilla warfare because it is the basis of today's guerrilla forces. The book was translated and published with an introduction by Samuel B. Griffith, Brigadier General, United States Marine Corps, retired in 1961. 3. Certification. Reviewed and approved this date by direction of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, M.P. Sullivan, for whom we have a signature above that title name there in normal print. Major General, United States Marine Corps, Deputy Commander for War Fighting, Marine Corps Combat Development Command, Quantico, Virginia. Distribution by, in quotations here, TJK. What that stands for, I won't speculate. Continuing now. Mao Zedong's On Guerrilla Warfare. Translated with an introduction by Brigadier General Samuel B. Griffith, United States Marine Corps, retired. Reprinted with permission of Mrs. Belle Gordon Nelson Griffith, presumably his wife. Contents. Introduction. Followed by Chapter 1, The Nature of Revolutionary Guerrilla Warfare, from pages 3 to page 11. Chapter 2, Profile of a Revolutionist, from pages 12 to 19. 3. Strategy, Tactics, and Logistics in Revolutionary War, from pages 20 to 26. Chapter 4, Some Conclusions, running from page 27 to 36. Next section here, Yuchi Chan, in brackets here, the translation of that statement, Guerrilla Warfare. Translator's note, running from page 37 to 38, followed by a further note from pages 39 to 40. Next, Section 2, Chapter 1, What is Guerrilla Warfare? From page 41 to 50. Section 2, Chapter 2, The relations of guerrilla hostiles to regular operations, from from pages 51 to 57. Section 2, Chapter 3, Guerrilla Warfare in History, from pages 58 to 65. Section 2, Chapter 4, Can Victory be Attained by Guerrilla Operations, from pages 66 to 70. Section 2, Chapter 5, Organization for Guerrilla Warfare, on page 71, followed by the subheadings of Chapter 5, How Guerrilla Units Are Originally Formed, also on page 71. Next, the method of organizing guerrilla regimes, from pages 77 to 81. Next, equipment of guerrillas, page 82 to 84. And lastly, for Chapter 5 of Section 2, Elements of the Guerrilla Army, running from page 85 to 87. Next here, Section 2, Chapter 6, The Political Problems of Guerrilla Warfare, running from page 88 to 93. And then the Strategy of Guerrilla Resistance Against Japan is Chapter 7, and that runs from pages 94 to 115. And then on page 116 begins the appendix section, which is basically nothing more than just citations for all the various details enclosed in the book, and that closes us out at the end with the cover following it. So then, with that introductory spiel out of the way, let us begin. Introduction. Chapter 1. The Nature of Revolutionary Guerrilla Warfare. We have here a quote from Chairman Mao Zedong. The guerrilla campaigns being waged in China today are a page in history that has no precedent. Their influence will be confined not solely to China in her present anti-Japanese struggle, but shall be worldwide. Quotation from Chairman Mao Zedong, Yuchi-chan, 1937. And based on the previous translation there, we can presume that Yuchi-chan means on the subject of guerrilla warfare, and that may have been from a speech of his at that point in time. Now here we begin, at last. At one end of the spectrum, ranks of electronic boxes buried deep in the earth hungrily consume data and spew out endless tapes. Scientists and engineers confer in air-conditioned offices. Missiles are checked by intense men who move about them silently, almost reverently. In 40 minutes, countdown begins. At the other end of this spectrum, a tired man wearing a greasy felt hat, a tattered shirt, and soiled shorts is seated, his back against a tree, barrel pressed between his knees, butt resting on the moist earth between sandaled feet, is a Browning automatic rifle. Hooked to his belt, 2 dirty canvas sacks, one holding 3 homemade bombs, the other 4 magazines loaded with .30 caliber ammunition. Draped around his neck, a sausage-like cloth tube with 3 days' supply of rice. The man stands, raises a water bottle to his lips, rinses his mouth, spits out the water. He looks about him carefully, corks the bottle, slaps the stock of the Browning 3 times, pauses, slaps it again twice, and disappears silently into the shadows. In 40 minutes, his group of 15 men will occupy a previously prepared ambush position. It is probable that guerrilla warfare, nationalist and revolutionary in nature, will flare up in one or more of half a dozen countries during the next few years. These outbreaks may not initially be inspired, organized, or led by local communists. Indeed, it is probable that they will not be. But they will receive the moral support and vocal encouragement of international communism, and, where circumstances permit, expert advice and material assistance as well. As early as November 1949, we had this assurance from China's number 2 communist, Liu Shaoqi, when, speaking before the Australasian Trade Unions Conference in Peking, now Beijing, he prophesied that there would be other Asian revolutions that would follow the Chinese pattern. We paid no attention to this warning. In December of 1960, delegates of 81 communist and workers' parties resolved that the tempo of wars of liberation, quote-unquote, should be stepped up. A month later, on January 6th of 1961, the Soviet premier, an unimpeachable authority on, quote, national liberation wars, end quote, propounded an interesting series of questions to which he provided equally interesting answers. We have here a quote from said Soviet premier. Is there a likelihood of such wars reoccurring? Yes, there is. Are uprisings of this kind likely to recur? Yes, they are. But wars of this kind are popular uprisings. Is there the likelihood of conditions in other countries reaching the point where the cup of the popular patience overflows and they take to arms? Yes, indeed, there is such a likelihood. What is the attitude of the Marxists to such uprisings? A most favorable attitude, it must be said. These uprisings are directed against the corrupt reactionary regimes, against the colonialists. The communists support just wars of this kind wholeheartedly and without any reservations. Pardon me. Continuing now. Implicit is the further assurance that any popular movement infiltrated and captured by the communists will develop an anti-Western character definitely tinged, in our own hemisphere at least, with a distinctive anti-American coloration. I see. The Americans don't use a U when they spell color. That's why I was confused. In a distinctive anti-American coloration. This should not surprise us if we remember that several hundred millions less fortunate than we have arrived, perhaps reluctantly, at the conclusion that the Western peoples are dedicated to the perpetuation of the political, social, and economic status quo. In the not-too-distant past, many of these millions looked hopefully to America, Britain, or France for help in the realization of their justifiable aspirations. But today, many of them feel that these aims can be achieved only by a desperate revolutionary struggle that we will probably oppose. Such is not a hypothesis, it is fact. A potential revolutionary situation exists in any country where the government consistently fails in its obligation to ensure at least a minimally decent standard of life for the great majority of its citizens. We have here from the previous sentence somewhere, with a little asterisk marking it, a citation of World Marxist Review, January 1961, which is doubtless in reference to that quote from the Soviet premier listed on page 5. Continuing now, though. A potential revolutionary situation exists in any country where the government consistently fails in its obligation to ensure at least a minimally decent standard of life for the great majority of its citizens. If there also exists even the nucleus of a revolutionary party able to supply doctrine and organization, only one ingredient is needed, namely, the instrument for violent revolutionary action. In many countries, there are but two classes, the rich and the miserably poor. In these countries, the relatively small middle class, merchants, bankers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, lacks forceful leadership, is fragmented by unceasing factional quarrels, and is politically ineffective. Its program, which usually posits a socialized society and some form of liberal parliamentary democracy, is anathema to the exclusive and tightly knit possessing minority. It is also rejected by the frustrated intellectual youth, who move irrevocably towards violent revolution. To the illiterate and destitute, it represents a package of promises that experience tells them will never be fulfilled. People who live at subsistence level want first things to be put first. They are not particularly interested in freedom of religion, freedom of the press, free enterprise as we understand it, or the secret ballot. Their needs are more basic: land, tools, fertilizers, some better than rags for their children, houses to replace their shacks, freedom from police oppression, medical attention, primary schools. Those who have known only poverty have begun to wonder why they should continue to wait passively for improvements. They see, and do not always through red-tinted glasses, examples of people who have changed the structure of their societies, and they ask, what have we to lose? When a great many people begin to ask themselves this question, a revolutionary guerrilla situation is incipient. A revolutionary war is never confined within the bounds of military action. Because its purpose is to destroy an existing society and its institutions, and to replace them with a completely new state structure, any revolutionary war is a unity of which the constituent parts in varying importance are military, political, economic, social, and psychological. For this reason, it is endowed with a dynamic quality and a dimension in depth that orthodox wars, whatever their scale, lack. This is particularly true of revolutionary guerrilla warfare, which is not susceptible to the type of superficial military treatment frequently advocated by antediluvian doctrinaires. It is often said that guerrilla warfare is primitive in nature. This generalization is dangerously misleading and true only in the technological sense. If one considers the picture as a whole, a paradox is immediately apparent, and the primitive form is understood to be, in fact, more sophisticated than nuclear war or atomic war, or war as it was waged by conventional armies, navies, and air forces over the course of this century, by which they mean the 20th century. Guerrilla war is not dependent for success on the efficient operation of complex mechanical devices, highly organized logistical systems, or the accuracy of electronic computers. It can be conducted in any terrain, in any climate, in any weather, in swamps, in mountains, in farmed fields. Its basic element is man, and man is more complex than any of his machines. He is endowed with intelligence, emotions, and will. Guerrilla warfare is therefore suffused with and reflects man's admirable qualities, as well as his less pleasant ones. While it is not always humane, it is human, which is more than can be said for the strategy of extinction. In the United States, we go to considerable trouble to keep our soldiers out of politics, and even more to keep politics out of our soldiers. Guerrillas do exactly the opposite. They go to great length to make sure that their men are politically educated and thoroughly aware of the issues at stake. A trained and disciplined guerrilla fighter is much more than a patriotic peasant, workman, or student armed with an antiquated fowling piece and a homemade bomb. His indoctrination begins even before he is taught to shoot accurately, and it is unceasing. The end product is an intensely loyal and politically alert fighting man. Guerrilla leaders spend a great deal more time in organization, instruction, agitation, and propaganda work than they do fighting, for their most important job is to win over the hearts and minds of the people. We must patiently explain, says Mao Zedong. Explain, persuade, discuss, convince. These words recur with monotonous regularity in many of the early Chinese essays on guerrilla warfare. Mao has aptly compared guerrillas to fish, and the people to the water in which they swim. If the political temperature is right, the fish, however few in number, will thrive and proliferate. It is therefore the principal concern of all guerrilla leaders to get the water to the right temperature and to keep it there. More than 10 years ago, I concluded an analysis of guerrilla warfare with the suggestion that the problem urgently demanded further serious study of all historical experience. Although a wealth of material existed then, and much more has since been developed, no such study has yet been undertaken in this country, by which they refer here to the United States. So far as I am aware, in Indochina and Cuba, Ho Chi Minh and Ernesto Che Guevara were more studious than us. Oh, pardon me here, they say assiduous. Not familiar with that term. One rather interesting result of their successful activities has been the common identification of guerrilla warfare with communism. But guerrilla warfare was not invented by the communists. For centuries, there have been guerrilla fighters. One of the most accomplished of them all was our own revolutionary hero, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. There should be a citation there. I'm not familiar with that gentleman. Those present at his birth would probably not have foretold a martial future for him. The baby was not larger than a New England lobster and might easily enough have been put into a quarter pot. That's in quotations there. Marion grew up in Southern Carolina and had little formal schooling. He worked as a farmer. In 1759, at the age of 27, he joined a regiment raised to fight the Cherokees, who were then ravaging the borders of the Carolinas. He served for 2 years, and in the course of these hostilities, stored away in his mind much that was later to be put to good use against the British. When the Revolution broke out, Marion immediately accepted a commission in the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. By 1780, he had seen enough of the war to realize that the Continentals were overlooking a very profitable field, namely that of partisan warfare. Accordingly, he sought and obtained permission to organize a company that at first consisted of 20 ill-equipped men and boys. Castro's base, quote-unquote, was the 12 men. The appearance of this group, with a heterogeneous assortment of arms and ragged and poorly fitting clothes, provoked considerable jesting among the regulars of General Gates. But Marion's men were not long in proving that the appearance of a combat soldier is not necessarily a reliable criterion of his fighting abilities. Marion's guerrilla activities in South Carolina soon told heavily on the British, especially Cornwallis, whose plans were continually disrupted by them. Marion's tactics were those of all successful guerrilla fighters. Operating with the greatest speed from inaccessible bases, which he changed frequently, he struck his blows in rapid succession at isolated garrisons, convoys, and trains. His information was always timely and accurate, for the people supported him. The British, unable to cope with Marion, branded him a criminal, and complained bitterly that he fought neither like a gentleman nor like a Christian, a charge orthodox soldiers are wont to apply in all lands and in all wars to such ubiquitous, intangible, and deadly antagonists as Francis Marion. However, the first example of guerrilla operations on the grand scale was in Spain between 1808 and 1813. The Spaniards who fled from Napoleon's invading army to the mountains were patriots loyal to the ruler whose crown had been taken from him by the Emperor of the French. We have here at the base of page 10 the citation regarding the various things here mentioned previously, Francis Marion in particular. Bryant, in the Song of Marion's Men, wrote some lines that showed that he had a better understanding of guerrilla tactics and psychology than many who have followed more martial pursuits. And here we have the poetry. It's not necessarily a poem or a song. It's a bit of both, I think. Anyway, woe to the English soldiery, that little dread us near. On them shall come at midnight a strange and sudden fear. When waking to their tents on fire, they grasp their arms in vain. And they who stand to face us are beat to earth again. And they who fly in terror deem a mighty host behind, and hear the trample of the thousands upon the hollow wind. Yes, that does paint a sordid picture indeed. Anyway, continuing now. However, the first example of guerrilla operations on a grand scale was in Spain between 1808 and 1813. The Spaniards who fled from Napoleon's invading army to the mountains were patriots loyal to the ruler whose crown had been taken from him by the Emperor of the French. They were not revolutionists. Most did not desire a change in the form of their government. Their single objective was to help Wellington force the French armies to leave Spain. A few years later, thousands of Russian Cossacks and peasants harried Napoleon's Grand Army at Kutzukov, pushed it, stumbling, starving and freezing, down the ice-covered road to Smolensk. This dying army felt again and again the cudgel of the People's War, which as Tolstoy, the Russian author Tolstoy, later wrote, was, quote, raised in all its menacing and majestic power, and troubling itself about no question of anyone's tastes or rules, about no fine distinctions, with stupid simplicity, with perfect consistency, it rose and fell and belabored the French until the whole invading army had been driven out. End quote from the quote there from Tolstoy. A little more than a century and a quarter later, Hitler's armies fell back along the Smolensk road. They too would feel the fury of an aroused people. But in neither case were those who wielded the cudgels revolutionists. They were patriotic Russians. Only when Lenin came on the scene did guerrilla warfare receive the potent political injection that was to alter its character radically. But it remained for Mao Zedong to produce the first systematic study of the subject, almost 25 years ago. His study, now endowed with the authority that deservedly accrues to the works of the man who led the most radical revolution in human history, will continue to have a decisive effect in societies ready for change. Here on page 11, we end part 1 of the introduction. So when I said initially during the preface portion that part 1 was the introduction itself, and that itself is broken into, I think, 4 or 5 separate portions. We're going to continue reading this one as part of this same recording, given the relatively short length of it. The individual chapters, however, will be read separately following this particular video or audio-video presentation. Audio-visual presentation, we'll say. Anyway, now on page 12, part 2 of the introduction. Part 2, Profile of a Revolutionist. We have here another quote from Chairman Mao Zedong. Political power comes out of the barrel of a gun. Mao Zedong, 1938. I remember that quote from Mao's Little Red Book, as a matter of fact. That's one of his more famous quotes and is quite well circulated in various circles. Anyway, Mao Zedong, the man who was to don the mantle of Lenin, was born in Hunan province in central China in 1893. His father, an industrious farmer, had managed to acquire several acres, and with this land, the status of a middle peasant, quote-unquote. He was a strict disciplinarian, and Mao's youth was not a happy one. The boy was in constant conflict with his father, but found an ally in his mother whose quote-unquote indirect tactics, as he once described her methods of coping with her husband, appealed to him. But the father gave his rebellious son educational opportunities that only a tiny minority of Chinese were then able to enjoy. Mao's primary and secondary schooling was thorough. His literary taste was Catholic. While a pupil at the provincial normal school, he read omnivorously. His indiscriminate diet included Chinese philosophy, poetry, history, and romances, as well as translations of many Western historians, novelists, and biographers. However, history and political sciences particularly appealed to him. In them he sought, but without success, the key to the future of China. His studies had led him to reject both democratic liberalism and parliamentary socialism as unsuited to his country. Time, he realized, was running out for China. History would not accord her the privilege of gradual political, social, and economic change, of a relatively painless and orderly evolution. To survive in the power jungle, China had to change radically, and to change fast. But how? Shortly after graduating from normal school in 1917, Mao accepted a position as assistant in the Peking University Library. Here he associated himself with the Marxist study groups set up by Li Ta-chao and Chien Tu-Hisui. Here he discovered Lenin, read his essays, pored over Trotsky's explosive speeches, and began to study Marx and Engels. By 1920, Mao was a convinced communist and a man who had discovered his mission: to create a new China according to the doctrine of Marxism and Leninism. It's here they say of Marx and Lenin. My habit here is to say Marxist-Leninism, my mistake. When the CCP was organized in Shanghai in 1921, Mao joined. The China Mao decided to change was not a nation in the accepted sense of the word. Culturally, China was, of course, homogeneous, both politically and economically. The China Mao decided to change was not a nation in the accepted sense of the word. Culturally, China was, of course, homogeneous, but politically and economically, China was in chaos. The peasants, 400 million of them, lived from day to day at subsistence level. Tens of millions of peasant families owned no land at all. Other millions cultivated tiny holdings from which they scraped out just enough food to sustain life. The peasant was fair game for everyone. He was pillaged by tax collectors, robbed by landlords and usurers, at the mercy of rapacious soldiery and bandits, afflicted by blights, droughts, floods, and epidemics. His single stark problem was simply to survive. The tough ones did. The others slowly starved, died of disease, and in the fierce winters of northern China and Manchuria, froze to death. It is difficult for an American today to conceive tens of thousands of small communities in which no public services existed, in which there were no doctors, no schools, no running water, no electricity, no paved streets, and no sewage disposal. The inhabitants of these communities were, with few exceptions, wholly illiterate. They lived in constant fear of army press gangs and of provincial officials who called them out summer and winter alike to work on military roads and dikes. The Chinese peasant, in his own expressive idiom, ate bitterness from the time he could walk until he was laid to rest in the burial plot beneath the cypress trees. This was feudal China. Dormant within this society were the ingredients that were soon to blow it to pieces and tear it asunder. An external factor had, for almost a century, contributed to the chaos of China, namely the unrelenting pressure and greed of foreign powers. French, British, German, and Russian vied with one another in exacting from a succession of corrupt and feeble government French, British, German, and Russian vied with one another in exacting from a succession of corrupt and feeble governments commercial, juridical, and financial concessions that had, in fact, turned China into an international colony. In brackets here, the American record in these respects was a reasonably good one. Mao once described the China he knew in his youth as semi-colonial and feudal in nature. And with good reason. He was right. Shortly after Chiang Kai-shek took command of the National Revolutionary Army in 1926, Mao went to Hunan to stir up the peasants. The campaign he waged for land reform in his native province can be described as almost a one-man show. The fundamental requisite in China was, then, as it had long been, to solve the land question. Reduced to elementary terms, the problem was how to get rid of the gentry landowners who fastened themselves to the peasants like leeches and whose exactions kept the people constantly impoverished. In the circumstances, there was only one way to accomplish this necessary reform, namely expropriation and redistribution of the land. Naturally, the nationalists, eager to retain the support of the landed gentry, historically the stabilizing element in Chinese society, considered such a radical solution social dynamite. But in Mao's view, there could be no meaningful revolution unless and until the power of this class had been completely exterminated. While Mao was making himself extremely unpopular with the landed gentry in Hunan, the revolutionary armies of the Kuomintang were marching north from Canton to Wuhan on the Yangtze River, where a nationalist government was established in December 1926. These armies incorporated a number of communist elements, but by the time the vanguard divisions of Chiang's army reached the outskirts of Shanghai in March 1927, the honeymoon was almost over. In April, Chiang's secret police captured and executed the radical labor leaders in Shanghai and began to purge the army of its communist elements. In the meantime, the left-wing government in Wuhan had broken up. The communists walked out. The Soviet advisors packed their bags and started for home. During this period, the communists were having their own troubles, and these were serious. The movement was literally on the verge of extinction. Those who managed to escape Chiang's secret police had fled to the south and assembled at Qingkangshan, a rugged area in the Fujian-Jiangxi borderlands. One of the first to reach this haven was the agrarian agitator from Hunan. As various groups drifted into the mountains and the mountainous stronghold, Mao and Chu Te, who had arrived in April 1928, began to mold an army. Several local bandit chieftains were induced to join the communist forces, whose operations gradually became more extensive. Principally, these activities were of a propaganda nature. District Soviets were established, landlords were dispossessed, wealthy merchants were quote-unquote asked to make patriotic contributions. Gradually, the territory under Red control expanded, and from a temporarily secure base area, operations commenced against provincial troops who were supposed to suppress the Reds. In the early summer of 1930, an ominous directive was received at Qingkangshan from the Central Committee of the party, then dominated by Li Lisan. This directive required the communist armies to take the offensive against cities held by the nationalist forces. The campaigns that followed were not entirely successful and culminated in a serious communist defeat at Changsha in September. On the 13th of that month, the single most vital decision in the history of the Chinese Communist Party was taken. The ultimate responsibility for it rested equally on the shoulders of Mao and Chu Te. These two agreed that the only hope for the movement was to abandon immediately the line laid down by Moscow in favor of one of Mao's own devising. Basically, the conflict that split the Chinese Communist Party wide open and alienated the traditionalists in Moscow revolved around this question. Was the Chinese Revolution to be based on the industrial proletariat, as Marxist dogma prescribed, or was it to be based on the peasant? Mao, who knew and trusted the peasants and had correctly gauged their revolutionary potential, was convinced that the Chinese urban proletariat were too few in number and too apathetic to make a revolution. This decision, which drastically reorientated the policy of the Chinese Communist Party, was thereafter to be carried out with vigorous consistency. History has proved that Mao was right and Moscow was wrong. and it is for this reason that the doctrine of Kremlin infallibility is so frequently challenged by Peking. In October of 1930, the Generalissimo, in the misguided belief that he could crush the communists with no difficulty, announced with great fanfare a, quote, bandit suppression campaign, end quote. This was launched in December. How weak the nationalists really were was now to become all too apparent. The campaign was a complete flop. Government troops ran away or surrendered to the communists by platoons, by companies, and by battalions. 3 more suppression campaigns, all failures, followed this fiasco. Finally, in 1933, the Generalissimo reluctantly decided to adopt the plans of his German advisors and to commit well-equipped, well-trained, and loyal central divisions to a coordinated and methodical compression of the communist-controlled area. As the nationalists inched southward, supported by artillery and aviation, they evacuated peasants from every village and town and constructed hundreds of mutually supporting, wired-in blockhouses. The communists, isolated from the support of the peasants they had laboriously converted, found themselves for the first time almost completely deprived of food and information. Chiang's troops were slowly strangling the communists. For the first time, communist morale staggered. It was in this context that the bold decision to shift the base to Shaanxi province was taken, and the now celebrated march of almost 6,000 miles was begun. They're referring here to the Long March. This was indeed one of the fateful migrations of human history. Its purpose to preserve the military power of the Communist Party. How many pitched battles and skirmishes the Reds fought during this epic trek cannot now be established. It is known, however, that for days on end their columns were under air attack. They crossed innumerable mountains and rivers and endured both tropical and subarctic climates. As they marched towards the border of Tibet and swung north, they sprinkled the route with cadres and caches of arms and ammunition. The Reds faced many critical situations, but they were tough and determined. Every natural obstacle, and there were indeed many, was overcome. Chiang's provincial troops, ineffective as usual, were unable to bar the way, and the exhausted remnants of the Reds eventually found shelter in the Loess caves of Pao An. Later, after the base was shifted to Yan'an province, Mao had time to reflect on his experiences and to derive from them the theory and doctrine of revolutionary guerrilla warfare, which he embodied in Yuqi-Chan. There, on page 19 and section 2 of the introduction. Now here, section 3. Strategy, Tactics, and Logistics in Revolutionary War. We have here another quote from Mao Zedong. The first law of war is to preserve ourselves and to destroy the enemy. Quotation from Chairman Mao Zedong, 1937. Mao has never claimed that guerrilla action alone is decisive in a struggle for political control of the state, but only that it is a possible, natural, and necessary development in an agrarian-based revolutionary war. Mao conceived this type of warfare as passing through a series of merging phases, the first of which is devoted to organization, consolidation, and preservation of regional base areas situated in isolated and difficult to access terrain. Here, volunteers are trained and indoctrinated, and from here, agitators and propagandists set forth, individually or in groups of 2 or 3, to persuade and convince the inhabitants of the surrounding countryside and to establish their support. In effect, there is thus woven about each base a protective belt of sympathizers willing to supply food, recruits, and information. The pattern of the process is conspiratorial, clandestine, methodical, and progressive. Military operations will be sporadic. In the next phase, direct action assumes an ever-increasing importance. Acts of sabotage and terrorism multiply. Collaborationists and quote-unquote reactionary elements are liquidated. Attacks are made on vulnerable military and police outposts. Weak columns are ambushed. The primary purpose of these operations is to procure arms, ammunition, and other essential war materiel, particularly medical supplies and radios. As the growing guerrilla force becomes better equipped and its capabilities improve, political agents proceed with indoctrination of the inhabitants of peripheral districts soon to be absorbed into the expanding, liberated, quote-unquote, area. One of the primary objectives during the first phase is to persuade as many people as possible to commit themselves to the movement, so that it gradually acquires the quality of quote-unquote mass. Local quote-unquote home guards or militia are formed. The militia is not primarily designed to be a mobile fighting force. It is a backup for the better trained and better equipped guerrillas. The Home Guard form an indoctrinated and indoctrinated and partially trained reserve force. They function as vigilantes. They collect information, force merchants to make voluntary contributions, again, quote-unquote voluntary, contributions to the war effort, kidnap particularly obnoxious local landlords, and liquidate informers and collaborators. Their function is to protect the revolution. Following Phase 1, in brackets here, organization, consolidation, and preservation, and Phase 2, in brackets here, progressive expansion, comes Phase 3, decision, or destruction of the enemy. It is during this period that a significant percentage of the active guerrilla force completes its transformation into an orthodox establishment capable of engaging the enemy in conventional battle. This phase may be protracted by quote-unquote negotiations. Such negotiations are not originated by revolutionists for the purpose of arriving at amicable arrangements with the opposition. Revolutions rarely compromise. Compromises are made only to further the wider strategic design. Negotiation, then, is undertaken for the dual purpose of gaining time to buttress a position, in brackets here, military, political, social, or socioeconomic, and to wear down, frustrate, and harass the opponent. Few, if any, essential concessions are to be expected from the revolutionary side, whose aim is only to create conditions that will preserve the unity of the strategic line and guarantee the development of a victorious situation. Intelligence is the decisive factor in planning guerrilla operations. Where is the enemy? In what strength? What does he propose to do? What is the state of his equipment, his supply, his morale? Are his leaders intelligent, bold, and imaginative, or stupid and impetuous? Are his troops tough, efficient, and well-disciplined, or poorly trained and soft? Guerrillas expect the members of their intelligence service to provide the answers to these and dozens more detailed questions. Guerrilla intelligence nets are tightly organized and pervasive. In a guerrilla-held area, every position without exception must be considered every person, without exception, must be considered an agent. Old men and women, boys driving ox carts, girls tending goats, farm laborers, storekeepers, schoolteachers, priests, boatmen, and scavengers. All are suspect. The local cadres, quote-unquote, put the heat on everyone without regard to age or sex to produce all conceivable information. And produce it they do. As a corollary, guerrillas deny all information of themselves to their enemy, who is enveloped in an impenetrable fog. Total inability to get information was a constant complaint of the nationalists during the first 4 suppression campaigns, as it was later of the Japanese in China and of the French in both Indochina and Algeria. This is a characteristic feature of all guerrilla wars. The enemy stands on a lighted stage. From the darkness around him, thousands of unseen eyes intently study his every move, his every gesture. When he strikes out, he hits the air. His antagonists are insubstantial, as intangible as fleeting shadows in the moonlight. Because of superior information, guerrillas always engage under conditions of their own choosing. Because of superior knowledge of terrain, they are able to use it to their advantage and the enemy's discomfiture. Guerrillas fight only when the chances of victory are weighted heavily in their favor. If the tide of battle unexpectedly flows against them, they withdraw. They rely on imaginative leadership, distraction, surprise, and mobility to create a victorious situation before battle is joined. The enemy is deceived and again deceived. Attacks are sudden, sharp, vicious, and of short duration. Many are harassing in nature, others designed to dislocate the enemy's plans and to agitate and confuse his commanders. The mind of the enemy and the will of his leaders is a target of far more importance than the bodies of his troops. Mao once remarked, not entirely facetiously, that guerrillas must be expert at running away since they do it so often. They avoid static dispositions. Their effort is always to keep the situation as fluid as possible, to strike where and when the enemy least expects it. Only in this way can they retain the initiative and so be assured of freedom of action. Usually designed to lure the enemy into a baited trap, to confuse his leadership, or to distract his attention from an area in which a more decisive blow is imminent, quote-unquote, running away is thus, paradoxically, an offensive act. Guerrilla operations conducted over a wide region are necessarily decentralized. Each regional commander must be familiar with local conditions and take advantage of local opportunities. The same applies to commands in subordinate districts. This decentralization is to some extent forced upon guerrillas because they're This decentralization is to some extent forced upon guerrillas because they ordinarily lack a well-developed system of technical communications. But at the same time, decentralization for normal operations has many advantages, particularly if local leaders are ingenious and bold. The enemy's rear is the guerrillas' front. They themselves have no fear. Their logistical problems are solved in a direct and elementary fashion. The enemy is the principal source of weapons, equipment, and ammunition. Mao once said, quote, "We have a claim on the output of the arsenals of London as well as of Hanyang, and what is more, it is to be delivered to us by the enemy's own transport corps. This is the sober truth, not a joke." End quote. If it is a joke, it is a macabre one as far as American taxpayers are concerned. Defectors to the communists from Chiang Kai-shek's American-equipped divisions were numbered in the tens of thousands. When they surrendered, they turned in mountains of American-made individual army jeeps, tanks, guns, bazookas, mortars, radios, and automatic weapons. On that note, in my particular copy of Mao's Red Book, there's pictures of Mao standing on an American army jeep overseeing his troops. Doubtless that's probably where those came from. Anyway, continuing. It is interesting to examine Mao's strategic and tactical theories in the light of his principle of, quote-unquote, unity of opposites. This seems to be an adaptation to military action of the ancient Chinese philosophical concept of yin-yang. Briefly, the yin and the yang, yin-yang. Briefly, the yin and the yang are elemental and pervasive. Of opposite polarities, they represent female and male, dark and light, cold and heat, recession and aggression. Their reciprocal interaction is endless. In terms of the dialectic, they may be likened to the thesis and antithesis from which the synthesis is derived. An important postulate of the Yin-Yang Theory is that concealed within strength there is weakness, and within weakness lies strength. It is a weakness of guerrillas that they operate in small groups that can be wiped out in a matter of minutes. But because they do operate in such small groups, They can move rapidly and secretly into the vulnerable rear of the enemy. In conventional tactics, dispersion of forces invites destruction. In guerrilla warfare, this very tactic is desirable both to confuse the enemy and to preserve the illusion that the guerrillas are ubiquitous. It is often a disadvantage not to have heavy infantry weapons available, but the very fact of having to transport them has until recently tied conventional columns to roads and well-used tracks. The guerrilla, by contrast, travels light and travels fast. He turns the hazards of terrain to his advantage and makes an ally of tropical rains, heavy snow, intense heat, and freezing cold. Long night marches are difficult and dangerous, but the darkness shields his approach to an unsuspecting enemy. In every apparent disadvantage, some advantage is to be found. The converse is equally true. In each apparent advantage lies the seeds of disadvantage. The yin is not wholly yin, nor the yang wholly yang. It is only the wise general, said the ancient Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu, who is able to recognize this fact and to turn it to good account. Guerrilla tactical doctrine may be summarized in 4 Chinese characters pronounced Sheng Tong Qi Sui, or Hisi, which translate to uproar in the east, strike in the west. Here we find expressed the all-important principles of distraction on the one hand and concentration on the other. To fix the enemy's attention is to strike where and when he least anticipates the blow. Guerrillas are masters of the art of simulation and dissimulation. They create pretenses and simultaneously disguise or conceal their true semblance. Their tactical concepts, dynamic and flexible, are not cut to any particular pattern. But Mao's first law of war, to preserve oneself and destroy the enemy, is always governing. Now here, Part 1, the introduction, Section 4. Some conclusions. We have here another quote from Mao to head this one up. Historical experience is written in blood and iron. Quotation from Mao Zedong, 1937. The fundamental difference between patriotic partisan resistance and revolutionary guerrilla movements is that the first usually lacks the ideological content that always distinguishes the second. A resistance movement is characterized by the quality of spontaneity. It begins and then is organized. A revolutionary guerrilla movement is organized and then begins. A resistance is rarely liquidated and terminates when the invader is ejected. A revolutionary movement terminates only when it has succeeded in displacing the incumbent government or is itself liquidated. Historical experience suggests that there is very little hope of destroying a revolutionary guerrilla movement after it has survived the first phase and has acquired the sympathetic support of a significant segment of the population. The size of this quote-unquote significant segment will vary. A decisive figure might range from 15 to 25% of the population of the territory. In addition to an appealing program and popular support, such factors are terrain, communications, the quality of the opposing leadership, the presence or absence of material help, technical aid, foreign advisors, or quote-unquote volunteers from outside sources, the availability of a sanctuary, the relative military efficiency, and the political flexibility of the incumbent government are naturally relevant to the ability of a movement to survive and expand. In specific aspects, revolutionary guerrilla situations will, of course, differ. But if the Castro movement, for example, has been objectively analyzed in the light of the factors suggested during the latter period of its first phase, a rough, quote, expectation of survival and growth, end quote, might have looked something like Figure 1. I'm not sure what they refer to here with Figure 1. There may be a photo somewhere that's either not present on this version or shows up elsewhere. Had an impartial analyst applied such criteria to Vietnam 6 to 8 months before the final debacle, he might have produced a chart somewhat like Figure 2. Again, I can't see them on this page. I think it's on the next page here. Oh, here we go. I see. I'll read Figure 1 and then cover Figure 2 and then return to the start of the sentence that mentioned them. Figure 1, the revolutionary guerrilla situation in Cuba. We have here 4 columns: detriments, Castro, incumbents, Batista, and remarks. And then it's broken into subsections A through, it appears to be J here, if I'm not mistaken. All right, detriments, appeal of program, Castro, progressive, considered to be a plus. Incumbent, Batista, static, minus. Remarks, Batista government, oppressive and reactionary. B, popular support, Castro movement, growing and active. Incumbent Batista, diminishing and passive. Detriment C, quality of leadership, for Castro, excellent and dedicated. For Batista, mediocre and to poor. Detriments D, quality of troops, good, improving, or excellent for Castro. And for Batista, good but decreasing to fair for Batista, yes. So therefore, they had better troops in the long term, whereas the other had poorer troops in the long term, even though they both had a fairly strong standing at the outset. E, military efficiency, growing for Castro, mediocre to poor for Batista, and remarks, this regards to guerrilla situations strictly. F, internal unity, was positive and strong for Castro's troops and weak for Batista's. Equipment was poor but improving to good as taken for Castro, and for Batista it was largely American-made equipment of excellent quality. And then remarks here, radios, transport, medical supplies, etc., available from incumbents. In other words, Castro had pretty piss-poor equipment to begin with, but as you kill off more enemy troops and steal their equipment, you eventually reach a median point of equal quality to your enemy. Base area terrain, operationally favorable for Castro and wholly unfavorable for Batista's men. Base area communications, operationally favorable for Castro, unfavorable to Batista. And sanctuary, none available to Castro, and for Batista, the remainder of the entire island. Remarks here, available for rest, retaining, and equipment, or retraining and equipment here. Now, Figure 2, as we say here, Figure 2, the revolutionary guerrilla situation in Vietnam. Detriments, appeal of program regarding Ho Chi Minh and his men was deemed to be dynamic with regards to the general population, and for the French, there was no program of appeal to the local populace at all. No attempt at garnering the support of hearts and minds whatsoever from the French colonial forces. Popular support for Ho Chi Minh continued to grow in Vietnam, whereas popular support for the French colonial forces was diminishing or slight over the course of the war. Quality of leadership for Ho Chi Minh and the French was both good, generally speaking. Quality of the troops for the Ho Chi Minh and his men was considered to be good and improving, whereas it remained very good and continued to be so for the French. In terms of military efficiency, here we have, let me see here. Yeah, military efficiency for Ho Chi Minh was deemed to be very good in guerrilla situations, whereas it was only considered to be marginally good for the French in those same sort of contexts. Internal unity was excellent among both forces. Equipment was fair but improving for Ho Chi Minh and his men, but generally better for the French. And here we have remarks, equipment received from China and taken from fallen French troops. So yes, that's correct. Ho Chi Minh and his forces had foreign aid, essentially. Operational terrain deemed to be favorable to Ho Chi Minh and wholly unfavorable to the French. Likewise for operational area communications. In terms of sanctuary, Ho Chi Minh and his forces had the ability to gain sanctuary and training amongst the Chinese, whereas the French were able to retain control over and gain support from the remainder of French Indochina. And we here have a note as well. Determinants are arbitrarily weighed on a scale of 1 to 10. So, referring back to the previous page here, page 28, I don't quite recall exactly where on the page I was, so I will pick an arbitrary location roughly midway through, and we'll run from there. In specific aspects, revolutionary guerrilla situations will of course differ, but if the Castro movement, for example, had been objectively analyzed in the light of the factors suggested during the latter period of its first phase, a rough expectation of survival and growth might have looked something like Figure 1, for which we've already covered. Had an impartial analyst applied such criteria to Vietnam 6 to 8 months before the final debacle, he might have produced a chart somewhat like Figure 2, again, which we've already reviewed. Here, determinants A, B, H, and I definitely favored the guerrillas, who also, unlike Castro, had an available sanctuary. Two others, C and F, might have been considered in balance. Although the Viet Minh had demonstrated superior tactical ability in guerrilla situations, an experienced observer might have been justified in considering military efficiency, quote-unquote, equal between the two forces. The French were learning. While other determinants may no doubt be adduced. I've never seen that term before. Opposite of deduce, I guess. While other determinants may no doubt be deduced, those used are, I believe, valid so far as they go, and the box scores indicative. These show that Castro's chances of success might have been estimated as approximately 3 to 2, Ho Chi Minh's as approximately 4 to 3. These analyses may be criticized as having been formulated after the fact. It is, however, my belief that the outcome in Cuba and Indochina could have been predicted sometime before the respective movements had emerged from the stage of organization and consolidation, namely Phase 1. At the present time, much attention is being devoted to the development of quote-unquote gadgetry. A good example of this restricted approach to the problem was reported in Newsweek. We have here a quote from Newsweek newspaper, July 3, 1961, article titled "The Periscope." Pentagon. A new and fiendishly ingenious anti-guerrilla weapon is being tested by the Navy. It is a delayed-action liquid explosive squirted from a flamethrower-like gun that seeps into foxholes and bunkers. Seconds later, fed by oxygen from the air, it blows up with terrific force. Oh, I see. That's a report from the Pentagon being cited in that newspaper. They're referring to something coming out of a flamethrower. I don't know quite what it is, but probably a new formulation of fuel. Continuing now. Apparently, we are to assume that guerrillas will conveniently ensconce themselves in readily identifiable quote-unquote foxholes and bunkers, awaiting the arrival of half a dozen admirals armed with flamethrower-like guns to march up, squirt, and retire to the nearest officers' club. To anyone even remotely acquainted with the philosophy and doctrine of revolutionary guerrilla war, this sort of thing is not hilariously funny. There are no mechanical panaceas. I do not mean to suggest that proper weapons and equipment will not play an important part in anti-guerrilla operations, for of course they will. Constant efforts should be made to improve communication, food, medical, and surgical quote-unquote packs. Weapons and ammunition must be drastically reduced in weight. There seems to be no technical reason why a sturdy, light, accurate automatic rifle weighing a maximum of 4 to 5 pounds cannot be developed. And the search for new and effective weapons must continue. But we must realize that quote-unquote flamethrower-like guns and bullets are only a small portion, a very small portion, of the answer to a challenging and complex problem. The position of active third parties in a revolutionary guerrilla war and the timing, nature, and scope of the assistance given to one side or the other has become of great importance. Basically, this is a political matter. Responsibility for a decision to intervene would naturally devolve upon the head of state. Any assistance given should, however, stop short of participation in combat. The role of a third party should be restricted to advice, materials, and technical training. The timing of aid is often critical. If extended to the incumbent government, aid must be given while it is still possible to isolate and eradicate the movement. If it is to the revolutionary side, aid must be made available during the same critical period. That is, when the movement is vulnerable and its existence quite literally a matter of life and death. From a purely military point of view, anti-guerrilla operations may be summed up in 3 words: location, isolation, and eradication. In the brief definitions of each term, it will be well to bear in mind that these activities are not rigidly compartmented, by which they should say here compartmentalized. Location of base area or areas requires careful terrain studies, photographic and physical reconnaissance, and possibly infiltration of the movement. Isolation involves separation of guerrillas from their sources of information and food. It may require movement and resettlement of entire communities. Eradication presupposes reliable information and demands extreme operational flexibility and a high degree of mobility. Parachutists and helicopter-borne commando-type troops are essential. The tactics of guerrillas must be used against the guerrillas themselves. They must be constantly harried and constantly attacked. Every effort must be made to induce defections and take prisoners. The best source of information of the enemy is men who know the enemy situation. Imaginative, intelligent, and bold leadership is absolutely essential. Commanders and leaders at every echelon must be selected with these specific qualities in mind. Officers and NCOs, that's non-commissioned officers, who are more than competent under normal conditions will frequently be hopelessly ineffective when confronted with the dynamic of totally different situations characteristic of guerrilla warfare. Finally, there is the question of whether it is possible to create effective counter-guerrilla forces. Can 2 shoals of fish, each intent on destruction of the other, flourish in the same medium? Mao is definite on this point. He is convinced they cannot, that counter-revolutionary guerrilla war is impossible. If the guerrilla experiences of the White Russians, which he cites, or the Mikhailovich are valid criteria, he is correct. But, on the other hand, the history of the movement in Greece during the German occupation indicates that under certain circumstances, his thesis will not stand too close an examination. This suggests the need for a careful analysis of relevant political factors in each individual situation. Mao Zedong contends that the phenomena we have considered are subject to their own peculiar laws and are predictable in nature. If he is correct, and I do indeed believe that he is, it is possible to prevent such phenomena from appearing, or if they do, to control and eradicate them. And if historical experience teaches us anything about revolutionary guerrilla warfare, it is that military measures alone will not suffice. That concludes the introductory section by that American military general listed at the very top. Next, here we would have, and will have in the next video, not this one obviously for reasons of length, the text itself, Yu Qi-an, or Guerrilla Warfare, by Mao Zedong. Now then, as far as my thoughts on that intro, it's pretty interesting stuff, and he does go into quite a great deal of detail, I must admit. But at the same time, I'm kind of keen to just sort of delve into the meat of the text itself. In either case, though, thank you for listening to this, and I look forward to having you accompany me in the following following chapter here. Ah, yes, now I see. Major General M.P. Sullivan, that's the name of the gent who did the intro here. In either case, as I said, thank you for joining us, and I'll see you on the next one. Auf Wiedersehen.